guys. Welcome to day 3 of Eek Week. Remember yesterday when I posted the review of The Innocents, I said I had completely accidentally done 2 movies that were directed by the same guy. I did not mean to do that by any stretch of the imagination because, as you know, if you watch my Innocents review, it was directed by Jack Clayton. And this movie is directed by Jack Clayton too, and it's really weird. I only remembered to do this one because it was one that I remembered fondly from my childhood. And then also I was, like I said, I was kind of looking to, because there was a couple movies that I had wanted to do originally for this series, but then I couldn't get hold of them for whatever reason, like they weren't streaming wherever I was. So I was kind of going through the Wikipedia page of movies set at Halloween and trying to like hit ones that I hadn't got around to doing yet. And I remembered this one and I was like, oh yeah, I really need to do that one. So I started looking for it. It was a bitch to find. I finally had to end up just watching like a free shitty one on YouTube, but I'd seen this movie before, so it wasn't really that big a deal. And then later on, I remembered that it was also directed by Jack Clayton, the same guy who had directed The Innocents back in 1961. And this is Something Wicked This Way Comes from 1983. Interestingly, too, I was watching some other reviews of it, and one of my favorite horror channels, Grumpy Andrew, who is a British guy, and he does Grumpy Andrew's Horror House or something like that. And last year, around Halloween, he had also done The Innocents and the next day, Something Wicked This Way Comes, 2 Jack Clayton movies. And again, I did not know that he had done that, so it's like, I'm not trying to, sorry, Grumpy Andrew, I'm not like ripping you off or anything. It was a complete coincidence. I didn't even remember that these 2 movies were directed by the same person. So, you know, I'm just getting that out of the way right now. So as I said, Something Wicked This Way Comes. This is a very interesting film coming out as it did in 1983. It was actually made by Disney, but this was right around the time period, because you remember, if you grew up during this era, I kind of feel like Disney were, obviously were well known for doing all their animation and all this other stuff, but it seems like in the 70s and 80s, they were kind of at 6s and 7s. Some things that happened that they felt like they were maybe kind of getting behind the culture because, obviously they had been offered to do Star Wars and they passed on it thinking it wasn't going to do anything. And they kind of got their ass handed to them on that. There was various other things. And I kind of feel like a new guy had taken over who I want to say was Walt Disney's son-in-law, had taken over. And he's like, look, we need to like catch up with the times. Everybody just knows us as like this family friendly like animation studio. And maybe we need to, shake things up a bit, get things, stop thinking so inside the box and whatnot. So they started making a series of, in hindsight, like at the time, they were not super successful films, but in hindsight, they made some really, really interesting decisions in the sense that they were still making what could ostensibly be called family-friendly films, but a lot of them had kind of a darker edge or, like a little bit more of a horror or sci-fi sensibility. This around the time, that was earlier than that, but they made like The Black Hole, which I think came out in the very late 1970s. They made The Watcher in the Woods, which was kind of pretty much a horror movie. They did like The Black Cauldron. So I think they were still trying to do family friendly, but they were trying to appeal to a slightly older audience or trying to do something a little bit darker, edgier. This was also around the same time period that they did Return to Oz, that really, really creepy shit with Fairuza Balk and stuff like that. So I feel like this is an era in Disney that, even though it wasn't financially successful, and in some senses the movies weren't entirely successful either, and this one is kind of an example of that. It was interesting that they were trying something like this, and a lot of the movies that they made during this time period, kids that grew up during this era like really remember them fondly, because it's like they were still family friendly, but they still had this really creepy, like dark sensibility to them. And this movie, Something Wicked This Way Comes, really does fall right into that kind of weird era. And it was financially pretty much a bomb. And I saw it a bunch back in the day, and I remember liking it but not loving it, because I was a big like Ray Bradbury fan. I was really into, and I was all into like that Twilight Zone kind of vibe, which this definitely has. I would also kind of put this in the same ballpark as like the Lady in White, which I talked about, a couple months back, I think, even though I should have saved it for Halloween, but I wasn't thinking about it because that's totally like a very, very Halloween-y type of movie. That came out a lot later, but I feel like it still kind of like occupies the same kind of space where it's like a family, like you can watch it with kids, but there's still like some really, really dark themes and there's like some really creepy shit in it. So even adults can like watch it and enjoy it. And it's I think it's like one of those good starter films. Like if you have a kid that seems like they're interested in wanting to watch scary stuff and horror, and you don't want them, seeing really, really scary shit, but this seems like it's, right in the middle. And I remember being a kid and this being really, really the kind of thing that when I was little, like really would have appealed to me. I believe I would have been 11 when this came out. And I don't think I saw it in the theater. I mean, my parents very well could have taken me to see it in the theater, but I kind of feel like maybe I saw it a year or two later, like on cable. And like I said, I had read the book. I don't remember if I read the book before I saw the movie or if I read the book, because I know that I was reading like Stephen King's Danse Macabre when I was younger. Maybe I was a little bit older then. And he like talked a lot about Ray Bradbury and he talks about the novel. So I know that I read it at some point, but I might have already seen the movie. So what ended up happening with this? This is based on a Ray Bradbury novel, although it's weird because Ray Bradbury, who actually like back in the 50s was friends with Gene Kelly. Now, Something Wicked This Way Comes, the book, actually first started out as a screenplay, and he wrote it for a movie, and Gene Kelly was supposed to direct it. And this was like back in the late 1950s. But I guess they never really could get the project off the ground. No studio wanted it. So over the next few years, Ray Bradbury rewrote it and wrote it into a novel, and that came out in 1962. And then, like, about 10 years later, everybody started thinking, well, maybe we should adapt this, because it is like a really cool story, and this is a good one to watch around Halloween, too, because even though it's not, like, explicitly Halloween, but it's obviously set around October, it's very autumnal, it has that very, autumn kind of vibe to it. And in the book, actually, it does take place, like, several days, like the week before Halloween or something like that. So it does really have that kind of, like, seasonal vibe to it, which the Lady in White has also, and it also has that nostalgic sort of dreamlike idealized 1950s Americana kind of thing to it too, although I would argue that this one, at least visually and story-wise, is darker and goes like in a more fantasy, like a dark fantasy direction than Lady in White, which is more just like a murder ghost story type thing. This one is a lot more like fantasy based. So in the early 1970s, when they were talking about adapting it at first, Sam Peckinpah was actually going to direct it, which might have been interesting. But but that didn't really work out. I think Kirk Douglas was going to play one of the roles in it. I think they were going to make it for $6 million, like in the early 70s. But again, it never got made. Project never got off the ground. So then in the late 70s, they started talking about it again. And Ray Bradbury had worked together with Jack Clayton, who, as I mentioned, directed The Innocents, among many other things. And they had worked together before, so they decided they were going to collaborate on the project. And again, for the third time, it didn't really go anywhere, even though there were interests. Like I said, Sam Peckinpah was directing it, maybe going to direct it. Steven Spielberg was also seemed to be interested, which also might have been really interesting, although I feel like if Steven Spielberg had done it, it probably would have been a good movie, but I don't know if it would have been as dark or as weird or as, like, strange. I don't know. It's kind of a strange movie, like I said. Because, as I mentioned, at this time, Walt Disney Studios was kind of looking for more properties that were sort of darker or aimed toward still a family, but, like, slightly older children. So they became interested in the project, so they kind of took it on. So at first, they were kind of like, I think Ray Bradbury actually wanted Christopher Lee to play Mr. Dark, who is, kind of the main villain, or perhaps Peter O'Toole. But Disney were like, yeah, we're not paying those dudes salaries. So they got, actually happily, they got Jonathan Pryce, who at that point was not super well known, but honestly, I think Jonathan Pryce is the best thing about this movie as Mr. Dark. He just is so... I mean, I love Jonathan Pryce anyway. He's like great in everything. This was one of his earlier films. Like I said, I think he'd been in films before, but he wasn't super, super well known. So obviously you didn't have to pay him as much as you would have had to pay Christopher Lee. But I mean, Christopher Lee would have been great to see too. He would have made a great villain. But there's just something about Jonathan Pryce in this role that's like really, really good. Because he's kind of like, he comes across as very sinister, but he also comes across as someone that you could believe people would kind of be attracted to him, or like kind of fall into like his trap or whatever. You know what I mean? He just was very charismatic. So what we have here, I don't know if how many people here have like read the book. This is a fairly faithful adaptation, although I do kind of, it's been a long time since I've read the book, but I do kind of feel like they took a lot of stuff out, because obviously the book has a lot more, like a lot richer type stuff going in it. But so what you have is there's this small town, I think it's called Greentown, Illinois, which is based on the town. I think Ray Bradbury grew up in Waukegan, and so it's based on that. So it's a very, very, I don't think that the movie ever specifically says what year it is, but you get, like I said, a very idealized 50s Americana, small town type of vibe from this. So in this small town, there are two main characters are these two young boys. I think there's 12 or 13 or something like that. And one of them is named Will Holloway, and the other one is named Jim Nightshade. Now, obviously, these two boys, I don't remember if they go into this, if they mention this in the movie, but it's definitely a big thing in the book, is that both boys, they live next door to each other, and they're best friends. They were both born on Halloween, but they were only born like a minute apart. And Jim is blonde and, Jim is dark-haired and Will is blonde. So obviously, and Stephen King talks about this when he talks about the novel, like he talks about this at great length, how it's this whole Apollonian, Dionysian type of vibe that's going, where it's like they're both good boys, but they're like the light and dark side of boyhood, I guess you could call it, because Will is kind of like more, you have to follow the rules and he's very good and very upstanding, whereas Jim isn't a bad kid, but he's kind of more, hey, let's sneak into the circus after dark and let's, get into trouble type of thing, even though it's not super malicious. He's just real, he's mischievous type of thing. So these two boys, like I said, they're even at the beginning, they're still trying to like, they have been best friends a long time, like pretty much their whole lives, because they grew up next door to each other. Will's family, I guess his mom doesn't really factor into the story all that much, but there's kind of like a big thing at the center of the story, like Will's relationship with his dad, who in the movie is played by Jason Robards, and he's also really great in this. I really like this role of his. It's very understated, but there's a lot going on, like in some of the things that he says and like his body language and his facial expression and stuff. And one of the hallmarks of Jim's, or rather Will's relationship with his dad, is that his dad was much older when Will was born. I think he was in his 50s, and he's a librarian and he has a heart condition. And so he feels as though he couldn't really give Will the boyhood that he deserved, because he's like, I was always older and I was kind of like in poor health, so I couldn't like play baseball with him and stuff like that. And there was also an incident which happened a while back that he still feels guilty for, where apparently Will fell into like a pond or something like that and started to drown. And because his dad was in poor health and his dad had never taught him how to swim, he didn't jump in and save him. And so Will was actually saved by Jim Nightshade's dad, who jumped in and saved him. Now, interestingly, the Nightshade family, the dad, even though that guy like jumped in and saved Will, like because he could swim, Jim's dad apparently just took off. He's not really in the picture anymore. So he's being raised by a single mom, who in the movie is played by Diane Ladd. She's not in it a great deal. She's kind of portrayed as sort of an over-the-hill woman, not desperate for love, but kind of like, like Jim comes home a few times and finds her like dancing with a new guy and all this other kind of stuff. So you can tell she's kind of like either really wants her husband back or thinks he's going to come back someday, even though Jim's pretty sure that he's not. Or she's kind of like trying to get with a new man, probably understandably because it's the 1950s. And as I said, Jim seems like even though he's a minute younger than Will, I believe, so he's always kind of like, even though it's just a minute, he always wants to be like older because he's kind of started to get interested in girls and things like that. And Will is still not really, like, so they're still, so one of them is maybe growing up faster than the other one. So there's that kind of whole thing too. Now, into this little small town Americana sort of vibe comes a carnival. Now, the carnival comes in autumn, which is unusual because usually they come in summertime. And so everyone's kind of talking about that. It's like, oh, that's kind of weird, like this train showing up. And also it shows up on this train in the middle of the night. And Will and Jim are pretty much, because they're coming home late at night because they got detention or something for acting up in class, they actually sneak down there to see it because they can kind of see the train coming from their window. And they're like, whoa, what the hell is that all about? So they go down there, and essentially the carnival like sets itself up like in just like a couple of minutes. It's like, shoo, and it's just like all there. So obviously there's something like magical and perhaps even diabolical going on about this carnival. Now, the carnival, which is run by Mr. Dark, I think in the movie it's called Mr. Dark's Pandemonium Carnival. I think in the book it's called Cougar and Dark's Pandemonium Shadow Show, which I really, really like. But maybe they thought that was a little too over the top for the movie. I'm not really sure. But yeah, because there is another guy named Mr. Cougar, who, with two O's, who is also kind of part of it. But Mr. Dark, played by Jonathan Pryce, is ostensibly the head of the carnival, and you're led to believe over the course of it, and this is not a spoiler of any stretch of the imagination, because like I said, this novel is very old, and the movie is old as well. He's essentially, they don't come right out and say he's like the devil, but he is like a very Mephistopheles type of character, or where he's like a tempter, essentially. And I think even one of the train cars, like one of the shots when it's first coming in, is called like the Tent of Temptation or something like that. So basically when this carnival sets up, and of course everybody in town goes to it because it's a small town and it's the 50s and that's just what you do, there are a couple of things that, and this is, in this sense, it's like the Twilight Zone, like I said, because it's almost kind of like a morality tale, because what the carnival does is that it seems to give you exactly what you want, like your deepest desire. Like, for example, there's a guy in town who is constantly reliving his old like football days, like when he was in high school or something like that. But now he was in an accident or in the war or something like that, and he doesn't have one of his arms and his legs was amputated. So obviously he can't really play football that well anymore. And so his greatest dream is like to have his leg and arm back and play football again. So when he goes to, because I feel like most of the carnival kind of just looks like a regular ass carnival, there's the strength shit and like the rides and the Ferris wheel and, the hoochie coochie girls or whatever they call them, like in the tent. That's what they used to call them back in the day. And, but the two kind of seemingly magical things are the Hall of Mirrors, which essentially when you go in, it shows you your greatest desire and then it gives it to you. And then there's also the merry-go-round, which, as Jim and Will find out when they sneak into the shit one night, like after closing, is that basically if it runs backwards, it takes a year off your life for every rotation going backwards. And when it goes forward, it, obviously packs years onto you. So it can make you younger, older, essentially like a time machine. So one by one, many of the townsfolk fall under the spell of Mr. Dark's carnival. Like I said, the football guy goes into the Hall of Mirrors and gets like his leg and arm back, and now, and it also makes him younger. Jim and Will's school teacher, the one that put them in detention, she's like an older, very school marmy type of, you kids, I'm gonna wrap you with a ruler. She's like that kind of lady. But then the kids are talking about, oh, back in the day, she was like the most beautiful woman in town. And so obviously she wants her youth back. So she goes into the Hall of Mirrors and is young and beautiful again. But as always with stuff like this, you get your deepest desire, but there's always like a sting in the tail. You know what I mean? So like, basically she gets to be young and beautiful, but then she's like looking at herself in the mirror going, hey, wow, look how hot I am and stuff like that. And then she's blinded, so she can't see herself anymore. And then there's other stuff happens. Like one guy, like his greatest wish is to be seduced by a bunch of foreign women or exotic women or something like that. So he basically gets sucked into the tent with like all the dancing girls, and there's all this other stuff going on. So that's kind of like Twilight Zone-y episode, and I kind of wish, because I feel like there was more of that in the book. Like I said, it's been a while since I read it, with all the townsfolk getting sucked in and getting their greatest desire, but then there being something like fucked up happening at the end, because you can't just, have what you want. But mostly the story focuses on Will and Jim and the relationship of like their relationship sort of fracturing, and also the relationship between Will and his dad, who at first is, skeptical, as you would be, like when Will and Jim are like, hey, this carnival is like magical and also possibly evil. And, they're trying to tell the adults like what's going on, and but particularly Will is trying to like not get the adults in town to like fall under the spell of the carnival because it's evil. But of course they don't believe him at first. And, Will's dad obviously doesn't believe at first either, but then he starts to believe it, even though he's tempted as well by Mr. Dark, who attempts to get him to take a ride on the magical merry-go-round that will take years off his life, so he'll get his youth back. He'll be able to be a dad to Will the way he always wanted to be, and he was, that he was regretful that he couldn't because he was older and in poor health and things. So he is tempted, but because, his dad is a really good, solid person, he ends up not, like, falling for it. So because the kids come in there, they sneak in and they see like a bunch of the evil shit going on, because basically what the carnival does, and I saw that Grumpy Andrew pointed this out too, because I was thinking about this when I was rewatching the movie, is that this is essentially kind of like Stephen King's novel Dr. Sleep, the True Knot. They're kind of like psychic vampires. They go around like feeding on people's fear and pain and stuff. And this is essentially what the carnival does. And as they research it, like Will's dad finds out that this carnival apparently shows up in this town. I don't know if it's just this town or just other ones. It's, like I said, it's kind of a fable or like a fairy tale, so it doesn't really matter. But this carnival shows up like once every generation and lures people in with their greatest desires, and then like kind of takes it away from them and feeds on their pain and their fear and their regret. So it feeds on like negative emotions, and it comes to town like every so often and just kind of gets who it can get and kind of sucks the life out of them. So that's essentially what it does. And like I said, Mr. Dark is kind of like I don't think they come out and say that he's the devil. Maybe they do. I think they actually do use that word, but he is like a very devilish figure because he's offering, these very tempting things that people might want. And a lot of people take him up on it. But of course, it's not going to work out the way you think it does, because that's just how it goes. So because the kids find out more about what's going on with the carnival, Mr. Dark apparently, like, he tries to kill them or try to like kidnap them and get them to come with him. So there's all kind of stuff where he does this. There's this great scene where they're all the circus people and the townsfolk that have been sucked into that, they have like this creepy kind of like parade like through the middle of the town, which I think in the movie happens in the daytime, but I could have sworn in the book it happened like at night, but I could be wrong about that because like I said, it's been a long time since I read it. But this parade that they're going through town, they're actually like looking for the two boys. So the two boys are like trying to hide out and like try to hide out from this fucking carnival, because they know that Mr. Dark is going to like, kill their asses or whatever. And like I said, there's this whole thing where Will's dad ends up saving, well, not only Will, because lying and not succumbing to the temptation of Mr. Dark, like making him younger, which he does want to do. You can see it in his face, but he's like, no, I can't do that because I have to like be there for my son. He also ends up saving Jim Nightshade, because Jim Nightshade, because he's a more rebellious sort of character, I guess, he's more willing to listen to Mr. Dark, and he wants to be older. He wants to be like a big guy. So he wants to get on the merry-go-round and like, be an adult so he can do whatever he wants to do. So he actually does get sucked in, and he's actually on the merry-go-round, and Will's dad actually does end up saving him off. So it's almost like not only was he able to save Jim, and maybe like in a weird way like save his own kid as well, but he's also kind of like paying back because it took Jim Nightshade's dad saved his son. So now he's, saving Jim Nightshade, just like the other dad saved his son. So it's kind of like this whole thing. So because they are able to fight the temptation, they are able to kind of like defeat the circus. So you're led to believe, Mr. Dark does get killed at the end, like he gets electrocuted, because there's this whole thing at the very beginning of this guy named Tom Fury, who's like a lightning rod salesman, and comes into town, and he's almost like the harbinger, because he comes there and he says to like Jim and Will, he's like, oh, I sell lightning rods. One of your houses is in danger, so you guys need to buy this. And so later on, so Jim actually does buy one, but then like later on in the movie, when Mr. Dark is like trying to get to them, I think initially in the initial script, it was supposed to be like a big hand like coming in the house, which I agree would have looked super cheesy. I'm not sure if they shot it. I think they did shoot it. And then when Disney saw it, they were like, yeah, that looks fake as hell. We can't do that. So what they ended up doing was, instead of like a giant hand coming into the house, they actually had like a spider attack. So they had like a bunch of tarantulas just like coming in through the ceiling and stuff like that. And they used real tarantulas. And it's not, super climactic, but it's still like pretty creepy crawly. But because of all the spiders and stuff like that in there, like then lightning hits the lightning rod and like makes all the spiders go away and stuff, because they're magical. So there was this whole thing. So interestingly, the thing about this movie is that there were a lot of production problems. Like I said, there was all kind of stuff about like the script. They didn't have like a massive budget, and they shot it, I guess, in the way that Jack Clayton wanted, that was going with the script that Ray Bradbury wrote. And then Ray Bradbury fell out with Jack Clayton about some things in the script, because there were some rewrites and there was like arguing over that. And then, like I said, they did some sequences, like the giant hand thing. And then Disney were like, yeah, we don't like that because it looks too fake, so we have to do something else. So it took a really, really long time to make this, because what ended up happening was Disney saw the cut. They didn't like it. They said, we don't know how we're going to market this, or it's just like not what we wanted. So then they spent like another year, I think, and like another $5 million reshooting some parts of it, including the spiders thing. They didn't like the original score. They thought it was too scary, so they had somebody else come in. I think it was James Horner, actually. He came in and did a score, which a little bit Star Wars-y, gotta say. Not super Star Wars, but there was like a couple phrases in there that I was like, that sounds a little Star Wars-y to me. But I'm just saying. But the original score, they said it was too scary and it just wasn't gonna fly. So this had massive, massive production problems. And in a lot of ways, you can kind of see that, because one, the edit's kind of strange, the pacing is a little strange. Some of the reshoots, you can tell they were reshoots because it was, however many months later or a year later, however much it was. And some of the shots that they did with the kids that played Jim and Will, the boys are clearly a little bit older, because, boys at that age, they grow very quickly. So I think particularly in the spider scene, you can see that they look considerably older. So it's a little strange. And I think some people were confused, because I saw one review that it's like, yeah, they thought for a second that the two kids had been on the merry-go-round that like made them older, because they obviously looked really older. So this was a very, very troubled production. And then when it came out, it didn't even make, I think it only made like a few $1 million. Like it didn't even make half its budget back. So it was considered like a pretty dismal failure. But that said, this is a decent movie. Considering, I think when I was watching it, I didn't realize how much of a clusterfuck the making of this movie was. So now that I know that, I can appreciate how it's amazing that they pulled a decent flick out of that just mire of fighting and misery and reshoots and re-editing and rescoring, and it was just all this massive fucking shit that they went through to make it. It's not a great movie, and it's a good adaptation of the novel, but there's so much of the novel that could be. I kind of feel like, as much as I like this movie, like I said, Jonathan Pryce is the best thing in it by a mile. Jason Robards also great in it. There's also Pam Grier is in this as well. She plays the Dust Witch, although she doesn't really have that much of a part. I don't even remember if she talks in it, does she? Maybe. But yeah, she's only in a couple scenes. Like I said, Diane Ladd is in it, but she's also only in a couple scenes. So there's kind of a lot of potential here in the novel. So I would actually really like to see maybe a series or like a longer film that's kind of a more faithful adaptation of the book with more of the cool stuff in it about like the townsfolk and stuff like that, like getting sucked into this carnival. Because like I said, this movie it's mostly based around the two kids, which is fine. I mean, because that's kind of, you know, what the book was about too. But it would have been neat if they could have gone more into, which they could do nowadays with, you know, better special effects and stuff with a bigger budget. You know, you could totally do like some really cool shit with all these people in town that were like, yeah, I want this. See, this is my greatest desire. And then going into the Hall of Mirrors and like having that and all this, you know, and then they could all have Twilight Zone twist to them, and it could all be really like interrelated. And I think that would be really cool. I don't know if they would do it nowadays because Dark Carnival is such a ubiquitous theme nowadays. I feel like it wasn't so much maybe in the 80s, and obviously in the 60s when this novel came out. I guess it was like a more original idea, even though, like I said, it was kind of Twilight Zone-y in the sense of being like a morality tale. But I don't know. So maybe, I don't know if maybe the Dark Carnival thing is maybe oversaturated, so I don't know if anybody would want to see this nowadays, but I actually would, because I actually really like this movie. It's a really good movie to watch around the Halloween season, because like I said, it's very October-y, it's very autumn, you know, it has an autumn vibe to it in the same way that The Lady in White does. And it's also a really good one to show to kids who are really, they want to see like a Halloween movie that's maybe scarier than something like Hocus Pocus, but it's still not as scary as, you know, a real horror movie. But this one definitely has like a lot more horror elements than a lot of the Disney stuff, the darker Disney stuff that came out around this time period. So it's definitely worth a watch. I don't think it's streaming anywhere at the moment. Might be on Disney Plus if you have. I don't have Disney Plus, but if you do, check and see and tell me if it's on there. Somebody posted it on YouTube for free, but it's really crappy. Like the video quality, the audio is okay, but the video quality is awful. But you know, since I needed to watch it, I was just kind of like, well, I've seen it before, so I'll just like, you know, I'll give this one a whirl, so I can get it done. But let me know if you guys have seen it, if it was one that you remembered from your childhood very fondly, because I know a lot of people did. And like I said, this was one that I saw maybe once or twice as a kid, and I remember liking it, but I was kind of like, well, that, you know, that was okay, and not really thinking that much about it. So it was like really interesting to revisit, and especially now, like in light of knowing about all the production problems that it had. So I don't know, I'd be interested to see, although like I said, Jonathan Pryce was so fucking good in this, it's like I'm not really sure who would replace him as Mr. Dark, because he really seemed, I mean, like I said, he was like the best thing about this movie. And honestly, you know what I love about this too? I love the fucking poster. Back in the old days when they used to do paintings for the posters instead of like, you know, photoshopped photo collages, there was like a gorgeous, and almost it looked like watercolor, to be honest, of him, you know, Jonathan Pryce with the top hat and all this other stuff, and he's with his hands out, and then there's like this big ball and like a carnival, like kind of dim in the bottom with the two kids running, and it's just like, it's a great, like the color scheme is just really nice. I really like the poster for this. But yeah, so like I said, I feel like it's a good movie, but it was a little bit of a missed opportunity, so I'd really like to see somebody else kind of take a whack at it, because I love the book. I really like Ray Bradbury stuff, and I really like this book. It puts me in the Halloween mood, like every time I think about it. So if you're looking for something like that, like for kids, that it's still pretty scary and it's still kind of Halloween-y, has that Halloween retro vintage 50s kind of vibe to it, then you could certainly do worse than this. Like I said, this and The Lady in White would make a really good double feature, now that I'm thinking about it. Maybe I'll do that. On Halloween, I'll just watch those two movies together. But yeah, so that'll do it for this Eek Week movie retrospective review extra special for Halloween week, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.